Jussi Parikka is originally Finnish, has also lived in Britain for a long time. He's a professor in technological culture and aesthetics at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton. And now he's also a 50% professor at FAMU in Prague, where he's leading a project on operational images, which has quite a lot to do with what Mercedes was just talking about. So Jussi Parikka has kind of been a bit of a household name for media scholars for a decade or so, and has written several books about media archaeology, as I mentioned, about the material histories of media, about insect media, which I think leads us a bit to the environmental humanities. Oh, what's the Norwegian word for that? Can someone help me? We must have one. Anyway, the environmental humanities are becoming more and more important, and as also climate-related and environmental art is clearly more and more important today. And a lot of your recent focus has been on this, this interplay between ecology, the environment, and technology and art. His newest co-authored book is titled Remain, and I would like to say that both your latest book and Mercedes Bunce's latest book are actually open access, so you can just go and download them whenever you like, or buy them. And Jussi Parikka's talk today is titled Webs, Models and Methods, Art Practices and Environmental Humanities.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we get the things up there? Nope. So while we are setting up, I can say a couple of words. Warm thank you for having me. There's the actual things that we should have there. A warm thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here talking about these intersections between digital culture, art, and in a way, even if I'm not talking about things AI, this follows up nicely from Mercedes. It's always a pleasure to be on stage with Mercedes anyway. I'll try to keep time. It's a really lovely opportunity to speak, but also to listen to others speak. I want to address our theme with an argument about art as not just art. And art practices not merely as practices inside and for artistic institutions and contexts. These words of art, not just art, were used by Matthew Fuller already in the early 2000s, when he was describing the then relatively new practices of software and software art in how they investigated the various affordances, possibilities of this new genre of art in digital culture. It went a way of probing the cultural reality of software and digitality. But I feel that those words are really useful nowadays, both in highlighting that art should not be reduced to public communication of complex scientific realities. Art shouldn't be reduced to mere ornamental value attached on top of science and technology, but itself, in the best cases, art itself is a method. It's a method of probing complexity, of ways of knowing and understanding relations and relations of relations and relations of relations of relations up until the end of relations, and how knowledge can be historicized in order to understand patterns of change and possibilities of change. This is a needed relief in these times of fascists and climate change, to name two pretty significant disasters we have to live with and have to come up with a solution to. I want to focus on the latter of two, less on fascists, more on environmental issues, and how art functions in this broader context of environmental humanities and climate collapse. For myself, this has become a central concern in how I want to unfold questions of digital practices and infrastructures from their environmental and ecological contexts. In which ways do digital forms of visualization, simulation, sonification, sensing, analysis become the basis of a reformed way of understanding the material reality in which we live in? In which ways are questions of energy and materials at the center of digitality as a material practice, from the CO2 load of cloud computing to broader fossil fuel dependency, from imaginaries of alternative, whether that of solar punk, to design and humanities work on infrastructure. Some of this work is done by scholars in history, some in theoretical writing, some in speculative design, but also some of it extends to curatorial methods as well. Some of my own activities over the past years have also extended from theory to curatorial work, like, for example, the recent work as a co-curator with Shannon Matten of the exhibition Libraries, Other Intelligences in Helsinki in the new and celebrated Audi Library, with works that define the multiple imaginary and poetic intelligences, in a way the different AIs, of energy and material infrastructures of the library. In a way, in this project, that is not going to be my main focus, this is just a preamble. Our curatorial plan was to use this as this architectural site as a way to think about methodologies of art in situ, mapping of the site of flows of matter, energy, and labor. Sami Bomik's performance with the performance group 00100 took participants to the usually closed-off spaces of the library and defined the backbone of the library, the infrastructural backbone, as the true center of automation, reliant on large-scale systems of energy and logistics. Similarly, I have had the joy of being part of IHME, Contemporary Arts Organization in Helsinki, where our 3-year theme is on environmental arts, dealing especially with water and liquids, with the 2020 Public Art Commission being actually Jana Vinderen and her work on sonic marine environments and recording technologies. In other words, many of the sort of themes and institutions and artists I've been collaborating with or writing about are somewhat defined by this nexus of artistic practice and environmental studies. This connection is fruitful because environmental humanities has started to tackle things like agency, cultural formation, social change, the entangled relations between human and non-human worlds, where you can see that it resonates with some of the big themes happening in art and cultural and media theory already. So from multi-species ethnographies to cultural theory of the post-human, from environmental histories and deep times to conceptualization of animal studies, the field also reaches out to art practices and indeed tackles with questions of elements and energy, infrastructure, and the ways in which they intersect with various political questions. But perhaps environmental arts practices should be less about genre categorization than about the questions: what sorts of insights, methodologies, affects, but also epistemological inroads are incorporated into these projects? How does art become something of an accomplice for environmental humanities without it becoming incorporated into the nowadays big fab of an ideology of solutionism? Idea that you can call in an artist when you have a big enough problem and an artist is supposed to problem solve that. No, we don't do that. Instead, we ask, how do we generate methods and approaches that really speak to the complexity of our hot topics at hand? I want to talk today about Thomas Saraceno's work, who's a contemporary artist, and his collective studios work, and see what becomes of art that switches registers between exhibition and curatorial setups, institutional collaborations with scientists. Saraceno's art has become one of the key recurring reference points in contemporary Anthropocene-inspired discourse, and especially good in terms of his work on air and Eroscene and how they imagine post-fossil fuel futures. But I want to look at his practices, especially with animals and spiders, arachnophobics, fear not, and how they connect with themes in history of science and science studies, and how these aesthetic practices feed into knowledge practices. And it really returns to those questions of where digital art and environment really intersect. So as said, we'll talk about webs and spiders, but we're going to talk about them from the point of view of scales, practice-based collaborations, and how sculptural and architectural models contribute to our sense of art and science. My question is how to connect to both the history of science of models and also the current discussions about contemporary collaborations and data physicalization. I talk about these in terms of working objects, a term that I borrow from historians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison to discuss the studio's visual objects, the objects that are employed in these studio and exhibition situations that you'll see soon. Sculptures and models, installations, operations from technical media of laser scanning to most analog of pencil on paper are part of the techniques of these works. These operations become relevant for a wider set of discussions about data and materiality, modelization and such. So even if most of my focus will be on the recent Palais de Tokyo show on air, perhaps some of you saw that as well, curated by Rebecca Lamarche-Vadel, I really want to acknowledge that this extends, of course, the studio's labor and the collaborative, collective work there. So, second part, on air, a museum of rarities. Our next stop, Palais de Tokyo, December 2018. What a museum of wonders. Spider webs of all sizes and shapes in carefully positioned spotlights in the darkened room. As one strolls past the natural formations of speculative architecture, one peeks in, lets the eye follow the complex links of threads and hybrid webs. Transparent frames of museum media, these sorts of Cartesian boxes, cabinets to peek in, admire the suspended animation of organic structures. The framed boxes are filled with the everyday of cobwebs, undusted building corners, and the more unfamiliar variations of the work of different spider species, illuminations on pedestals, making them a form of an installation that lights up, suspended in the air on multiple levels and layers of hybrid webs. It feels like a parallel track of modernity that deviated at one point from the heavy structures of concrete and steel to the breathing airiness of spider silk. After navigating past the layered structures of webs, one hears a gentle vibrating hum, a slow rhythmical oral pattern with long strings filling the air like a softly moving sculpture, slowly shifting in and out of view. The sound frames the space differently with the large-scale aeolian harp that plays the thin threaded modified spider silk, like structures of strings of a natural automata that invented music before it was sung by human mouths and played by human hands. If you continue deeper into the building, you find that the webs have grown to human size, and the whole room is an interconnected vibrational ecology. Step in, and you step in with everybody else in the room that feeds back as infrasound, below 20 hertz, that it feels everywhere except in your ear. Further on, you will find various sonic and visual instruments and mechanisms that highlight the different scales of webs and dust and structures and air, and the various constructions that shift registers between the natural and the technical, demonstrating that either category is as arbitrary as the other. One might ask, what sort of a weird museum is this? What sort of a misperception of art is this? What lineage of curatorial thinking could this link up with? It mixes up the categories of art and natural history, spiders, but also has its own quirky precedents in the history of collections and imaginary architectures. In a way, one could imagine this as a version of the earlier cabinets of curiosities, of various sorts of optical wonders, unusual and rare animals, museums of rarities. I quote Leibniz here, as he proposed towards the latter part of 17th century. But besides that sort of a curiosity for nature and techniques on display, add a bit of imaginary world of academia some 50 years later from Leibniz, as voiced by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels. So Swift takes us to Academy of Lagado, Also a curious place of invention of all things, satirically presented as more or less useless or absurd. This is a wonderful section of the book. In this mix, we encounter the following case that speaks to worlds of air, upside down, of insects as architects, and spider webs as art and material to be cultivated. Let me quote Jonathan Swift here. There was a most ingenious architect who had contrived a new method for building houses by beginning at the roof and working downward to the foundation, which he justified to me by the blight practices of those two prudent insects, the bee and the spider. Then the academy continues to a room where, Swift narrates, where the walls and ceiling were all hung round with cobwebs, except a narrow passage for the artist to go in and out. And Swift continues, at my entrance, he called aloud to me not to disturb his webs. He lamented the fatal mistake the world had been so long in of using silkworms, while we already had such plenty of domestic insects who infinitely excelled the former, because they understood how to weave as well as spin. And he proposed further that by employing spiders, the charge of dyeing silks should be wholly saved, whereof I was fully convinced when he showed me the vast number of flies, most beautifully colored, wherewith he fed his spiders, assuring us that the webs would take a tincture from them. And as he had them of all hues, he hoped to fit everybody's fancy as soon as he could find proper food for the flies, of certain gums and oils and other glutinous matter to give strength and consistence to the threads. So it would be very tempting to see the contemporary artist Thomas Saraceno's work and the whole show on air as a variation on themes of cabinets of curiosities, as well as imaginary academies that once even ridiculed in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver, but now spring to life with the help of material scientists who are actually, as we know, cultivating silk material, spider silk material. Saraceno would be at home in Swift's academy for sure. Well, of course, there would be another context where he links up with the various experiments of art and science since the Cold War, not least Alvin Lucier's work. But instead of tracking a historical genealogy for Saraceno's work, I'm more interested in questions of practice, right? And really speaking to our theme today. What sort of objects of interest, of knowledge, of sort of matters of fact and concern to echo Bruno Latour? What sort of conceptual, visual, sculptural, energetic and oral objects travel in the circuits of contemporary art that works by way of large-scale teams and collaborative settings with material engineering and sciences, as well as climate science, meteorology, bioacoustics, biotremology? What sort of digital aesthetics and culture emerge when we understand that these assemblages are thoroughly embedded in links with science and technology, with cultural theory and aesthetic practices? Section 3, webs. So when you enter the exhibition and we look at these clips, even for the casual observer, it seems that Studio Saraceno's work has it all. Environmental agency, tick. Relational ontology, tick. Awareness of ecological issues, tick. Occasional nods to the context of planetary scale cognitive capitalism, yep. It's almost too easy for a cultural analyst to step in and start pointing these connections and unfold a discourse about entanglements and relations. Because the work is already so involved in the variety of discourses about the Anthropocene, from work by famous theorists such as Anat Singh to Bruno Latour, Karen Barad to Stefan Helmreich and many others, speculative design, speculative architecture, etc., etc. But more than a rhetorical figure of theory that is reflected in the works, it becomes also a theme that proceeds on the material level of the practices, that establish really concrete situations, links and models and things to think with. This means that Saraceno's work can provide a further set of useful ideas that are springboard for a cascade of questions about contemporary digital technologies, logistics, infrastructure, even as their collaboration that I will mention later, collaboration with machine learning teams, technology, in these fragile realities in which environmental arts bounces off multiple institutional contexts while articulating its mobilization of nature in a context that is nothing less than collapsing and vanishing. In other words, I'm really interested in what does it mean to refer to any kinds of entities that we refer to as natural in the context of the reality of climate collapse, mass-scale extinction, biodiversity loss, global warming, you know the story. But besides the fact that Saraceno is theoretically obvious, a similar dilemma concerns the web. The metaphorics of the web have become all-pervasive, at least since network culture of the web, since the middle of the 1990s, which makes it feel like an inflated figure in itself. And it might make it really difficult to talk about it in interesting ways. But it has become a constant reference point in art and technology. It has become a constant reference point in popular culture, but also in material sciences, with a special interest in the possibilities of synthetic materials inspired by webs. But besides the mythopoetic lineage from Arachne, as in Greek mythology, the web has also become a figure of mathematical, geometric, and scientific operations that really speaks to its complexity as a model of space and agency. Hence the theme that starts to unfold, that these are really modelizations and data physicalizations of complex realities. So in this manner, Studio Thomas Saraceno stages the web as a living sculptural diagram, both situated as an object of visual arts, yet indicative of the mathematical potentials of abstraction. So on the one hand, the web is about speculative architectures. On the other is about the animal worlds of non-human invertebrate species. On the one hand, it is about signals and vibration as acoustic ecologies. On the other hand, it's about environments and extended cognition. Let me elaborate what I mean by this. Oops. Webs of attention sits as part of webs of various scales that we saw already, and the various human, technological, non-human animal agencies, and as such also becomes recursively echoed across the curated space. I'm thinking about Palais de Tokyo, but you can see how it works with the other scales of webs. As volumetric diagrams, sorry, I'm actually going too fast. As volumetric diagrams and as speculative design, the piece in the various metal frames displays arthropod architecture, a theme identifiable, for example, as part of late 19th century and 20th century architectural discourse already, as well as the legacy of anti-architecture that employs artistic ways of dealing with questions of construction, space, energy, and materiality. So Mark Wigley characterizes Saraceno as part of the lineage of experimental anti-architecture from the 1920s to 1980s, from Buckminster Fuller, Frei Otto, Konrad Wachsmann, Cedric Price, Konstantin Doxiadis, Superstudio, and Argitsum, who in Wigley's works systematically dissolve the solidity of buildings into diaphanous webs, networks of almost nothing in which society would now suspend itself. At a different scale, and now we go to this, the room-sized web of algorithms is an ongoing experiment which echoes Antonio Damasio's and Andy Clark's work on extended cognition and the embodied brain. It also echoes the work in media theory by Catherine Hales when she argues that the cognitive non-conscious works in ways that is embedded in these highly complex systems that are adaptive and recursive, all the shifts about cognition to the outside world. We can call these spatialized infrastructures of cognition if by cognition we start to include material structures like acoustics and architecture in general. So Saraceno's work seems to be making this really clear. almost too clear in the sense that it really echoes and tracks a lot of lineages in relation to cognitive theory and research, advanced cybernetics, even robotics to an extent as well, but does it via the notion of the web and its material presence. Furthermore, algorithm speaks of localizable cognition that is not really about individuals that are located in the space. As an entangled spatial setting, it spreads out. It becomes a vibrational universe that troubles any focus on single agency. Threads and webs embody forms of subjectivity entangled in a shared signal space that reaches out to cosmic dimensions, while itself working in ways that registers all the things often unseen, unfelt. I'm going to quote Saraceno Studio's words about this. The signals that the participants rearrange come from disparate places and speak other idioms, polluting particles and temperature differential, supernovas and distant galaxies, shifting temperatures and weather patterns, local spiders, vibrational communication. From infinitely small to infinitely large, these movements between nested scales cause the room to shift in response. The lights fade, echoes increase, and in the darkness, the room enlarges infinitely, much like the expanding universe, asking those present to listen or else face the eternal silence of extinction. There's a sort of interesting two-step routine going on here in terms of what he and the studio talks about and shows, where animal studies and art practices meet. The two-step consists of signal and registering, trace and inscription, capture and graph, where the focus on signal transmissions, that it really is about signal transmission in very physical sense, gives way to recording and sensors as a central trope. It really is about what is recorded and perceived as perceivable in the first place. What sort of a near invisible signals or weak vibrations are recordable and measurable? It makes sense to pair it up with another important work in the exhibition and in his recent work, aerographies. Combines the work on spiders and balloons to create living inscription systems. The quote is up there. So, pens suspended to balloons draw with black carbon ink pollution from the air from Mumbai and reveal trajectories drawn by the air, enlarging the territories of our imaginations. Spiders' webs laid out on paper produce new spider maps, while trajectories of balloons that float freely in the air without the help of fossil fuel traces out aeroglyphs. Together, these aerographies are letters, characters, and signatures of a new language for the Aerocene era. Gestures, interaction, events leave a trace. Drawing with air, the movements of persons, sounds, and spider webs translate as potential language of earthly phenomena, an emergent cartography of the air and its installation view. While the poetic description of the sculpture might offer a generic atmosphere, perhaps a mood for the work, the more media studies focused implications are interesting. Themes of measure and inscription become here installed as an assemblage of elements that also start to play more directly with the epistemological implications of these works, and with direct references to environmental humanities. In addition to the sort of moods and atmospheres it creates, affects and air, the various sculptural systems are really materially about inscriptions, inscribing graphs, traces, and the various material links that insert the question of extended cognition much outside the head into experimental systems, and also experimental systems in the very scientific sense. So when historian of science Hans-Jörg Reinberger, in another context, speaks of spider webs, just like models for experimental systems in science, we can here, for the sake of the argument, claim that remove the just like. These webs and other apparatuses are experimental systems that both model capturing signals, traces, vibrations, and materials, and also model their own behavior in a recursive fashion. The setup of the web becomes a recursive commentary about experimental systems in our contemporary digital contexts and how they inscribe and track things we perceive and don't perceive. What of course in these works easily shifts out of view is the world of measurement instruments as the condition of existence of the work itself. Piezoelectric sensors for pressure, acceleration, vibration, custom-made microphones, laser scanning of complex volumes. This is also, and I'm going to really briefly mention this because I know that I'm approaching half an hour soon. This is also where the really interesting links with other sorts of collaborations emerge as a key element of the work as well. The working objects of the studio have included developing new visualization techniques for laser scanned modelization of these three-dimensional webs, such as funnel and sheet webs. And this includes work with material scientists. And these 3D networks become multiple kinds of objects, three-dimensional architectural signaling spaces, but also that investigate the particular topological material affordances of what a web does as a signaling space that can be scaled up and down. In some of the current work of the studio, they collaborate with MIT in order to indeed map the material qualities in context of machine learning, mapping for optimization through web structures, and the various material binds that can then be reused in engineering and construction, right? So from these spatialized models, it also becomes a model for material variation and optimized structures. So it really is about finding ways of optimization in terms of material qualities. And this is my conclusion coming up now. So really briefly, even if I had to run through so many themes, the reason why I want to highlight Saraceno's work is not to celebrate the already existing superstar status, that is not very interesting, but investigate of how these works sit as part of an aesthetic invention and collaborative work, epistemologies of these working objects that are sculptures and visual objects across architectural, sculptural practices and other questions that are also useful in considerations when we discuss ecology and environment, technology and methods. Studio's Thomas Saraceno makes things, but it's not really about maker culture. Instead, it taps into the longer lineage of art practices that are interested in architectural and aesthetic models, and as such also sits in the lineage of other recent, superstar artists such as Olafur Eliasson, but also the largest speculative body of art and science since the Cold War. Their brand of making is also large-scale, speculative, and works in ways that models working objects for the sciences, like in the custom-made visualization and laser scanning experiments. While I didn't really get too much time to talk about collaboration, it is of course an interesting theme in terms of how the methods emerge from studio environments. Similarly, there would be an interesting further question as to how environmental humanities already here becomes environmental post-humanities in transversal ways, echoing Rosie Braidotti, Matthew Fuller and others. That is about mapping relations and indeed relations between relations and connecting in them new ways across the usual dichotomies, binaries and juxtapositions of our knowledge. Besides the work that produces working objects, and is the backbone for a variety of ways of building theoretical ways of understanding the world. It also becomes a way of probing models of itself. In other words, there's an interesting question underneath this. How do we do this? In other words, as part of the thematic work about environments of animals, biodiversity, elements and energy, we must consider the impact that happens on the level of indeed practice. The methodological invention that I was calling for do not come as ready-made toolboxes of methods, but emerges from an appreciation of practices, as Celia Lurie puts it, the primacy of action in establishing new interdisciplinary methods leads us to look at new questions as well, or the question, what sort of an intensive, transformative space are they carving for knowledge? How they constitute problems that are, in Luri's words, interruptions of the historical present, and how the inventiveness of art practices can be described in these contexts of academic and para-academic practices. These are some of the not-so-modest questions that emerge in the interstitial spaces between environmental humanities, media theory, and indeed, art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jussi. So we have Mercedes and Bushi here, and I would like to ask, do any of you have questions for our speakers? Yes, at the back. Oh, that was quick. You've got a microphone, great.
Thank you. So first off, thank you, Mercedes and Jussi, for your amazing talks. It was really interesting. And my first question goes to Mercedes. So you were talking about how we need to perceive the human intelligence in more of a calculative way. And then you were showing the neural network that recognized clouds as animals. And that reminded me that the human consciousness actually has the tendency to do the exact same thing. So we recognize patterns which are not really there by seeing things that are familiar to us, because this is how our consciousness works. And do you think that this deep similarity between how an artificial neural network works and how human intelligence works has something to say for how we need to perceive human intelligence? Because they do the exact same thing.
That's a good question. I mean, it's interesting because they do the exact same thing. And this Google image, it's actually called inceptionalism. It's called deep dreaming. So there is obviously an overlap. But I think what's interesting is that there's an overlap in part. We all know, I mean, when describing that we humans see something and project, our brain doesn't, a lot of times doesn't really look at like what it sees, like our eyes, my eyes see you all now, but I'm sort of, before I really see you, I imagine, oh, I have an audience in front of me. Without really looking, you might just be little statues and I need to take a closer look. So we are very easily trapped by something we want to see or we expect to see. I think it functions a bit different if you look at the details with neural networks. The effect is the same, but in the end it functions a tiny bit different because it depends on what they're trained on. I mean, but then taking the full cycle around, what we see also depends on what we train to see. And we see this a lot in post-colonial discourse. Where do we see racism? Where don't we see racism? And later understand, oh, that was actually quite a racist moment. So I think what I'm quite fascinated in is that it's really hard to get these two intelligences. I think they're different, but they also overlap. And it's very, very hard to describe when they overlap and when they don't overlap. At the moment, I think what we see most is that we project onto the digital intelligence, it functions like us. So I think at the moment we are at a really important moment where we need to understand how it actually really works. So, and stop the projection.
Sorry, can I say something about it? I mean, sorry, I'm an artist that works with artificial intelligence.
Just wait for the microphone.
I'm an artist that works with artificial intelligence.
Wonderful.
And I think, I mean, this is one of the major misconceptions, that intelligence is shackled to what mind is. And I think this is fundamentally wrong, because here you also see where the whole hype starts to take off and propel these misconceptions in the public sphere. That I think what we have with artificial intelligence, it's a collection of high order of statistics. And of course, you could reduce human intelligence to a computational model that has sequences. But I think there are so many things, and sorry, I just continue in a question. because I also see where, for instance, in the culture industry, there tends to be a myopic view towards what artificial intelligence is, that they actually capitalize on these surface encounters. Okay, what kind of images it produces. And I think this is also such a difficult discipline, what artificial intelligence is, because it's partly computer science, it's partly mathematics, and a big part is philosophy. Of course, the mathematics, when you take it to a singular account, the mathematics is, it's undergrad level math. You could do that with some training, you could master that. The computer science as well, it's if you do the object-oriented approach, okay, you could learn that in a couple of maybe a year or two or something like that. But the philosophical part, it's such difficult when this is combined with the technological question and with the mathematical question. You create such a distorted view of what actually is going on in these algorithms, because there is something very extraordinary happening. And I can give you an example. I will conclude with a question. That, for instance, the GANs that you show, the pics-to-pics that see certain elements for what it gives the output. But what it also does, for instance, in the facial composition, what you can do with these GANs, you can reduce the face to a certain vector. Okay, test certain eyes and whatever. If you combine that, for instance, with a hamburger, that also to a vector, what you can do, you can actually, and it's called the latent space, and the latent space is actually the space between this input and output that contains the most compressed information. So it already contains every output that it can generate. So it's kind of the model. But what happens there is that the first time in history, we have there a mathematical representation of what a hamburger vector looks like combined with a facial vector. And I think this is quite extraordinary because, of course, in set theory you can explain this, but to visualize as a representation, I think this is quite amazing and philosophically very interesting. And this is where my question comes in. I exercise a lot in programming and doing the philosophy and the mathematics behind it, but I don't see this almost 3 careers in one. And I think if you want to put this on a kind of artistic intelligence level, I don't know how to start to do this. Computer scientists working with machine learning are very scarce. Even artists working with machine learning are even scarcer. So I think, what kind of strategies would you entail or abide to combine this? Because I don't have a clue, actually.
It overlaps a bit to what Jussi described, that you have this interdisciplinary space opening up. And it's quite tough. So up till now, my answer was always have a nerd as a best friend who can then help you with all the computer science questions. But I think that's maybe, you're right, that's not enough anymore. So I know from some institutions that they really sort of actively, at the moment, create lists who could be collaborators, and that this technical knowledge becomes more important, and that people are sitting in big teams now around tables to plan those art projects, for example. So because the input is so specific and difficult, so I think the Serpentine Gallery has a number of programmers, some sitting actually in the US, some sitting in London, or most of them Skype just in. And they work with them, and there's also a technology collective. But it's all about this interdisciplinary moment, which of course makes art production much more difficult, but also somewhat exciting, and it's also questioning. We question those forever, what's the status of the artist, how much is the curator part of the work, and all of that. And I think Jussi described in his sort of environmental art the same moment. Probably the artist doesn't produce the spider webs. He has probably the spiders do that, and he probably has a biologist somewhere who helps to make the spiders happy.
I can pick up on some of what they have. There's I was talking with this is a funny anecdote as well. I was talking with an ex-colleague because I was in Bauhaus University in Weimar for a while, and it was a lovely colleague that I had as well, who was one of the spider assistants, spider feeders for a while at Saraceno Studio, and I was telling that at one point in Berlin, when you go to a party, every second person seemed to be a spider feeder at Saraceno Studio. It's a massive studio of 60, 70, 80 people. So in terms of, I mean, I might provoke and also inspired by your thoughts as well. I was thinking about this. This is slightly a provocation, but there's a slight danger that a lot of the kind of methodologies that are coming out, or let's say a lot of the outputs coming out in context that we brand, especially in popular cultural level, and in some artistic discourse through as AI art, and how it resonates with some things in digital humanities is a turn to neoconservatism. It somewhat reflects some kind of a problematics of the idea of the new as the ultimate value, which is actually a theme that comes through the art market, not through a critical art discourse. We fought in arts and humanities to get rid of this for decades, and now it's coming back with a vengeance, which is the really interesting theme. And that's why for me, the interesting themes are exactly what you just said, the step back in terms of more of the institutional critique in the art discourse sense as well. What is the mode of function of these collaborations? What is the mode of political economy behind them as well? What is the sort of attachment come through that as well? And that's to me where the really interesting thing comes in, not through the sort of a discourse of, can we produce another new painting? Who cares? Sorry, I'm provoking.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for very interesting talks. We have lunch outside, I believe, now. And we'll meet again in an hour in here. Thank you to Mercedes Banz and Jussi Parikka.